He placed the small black recorder on the table without saying a single word and pressed the only button on it with a kind of quiet finality that didn't leave space for questions or protests from me or from anyone else in that room. The moment I heard my own voice echo through the kitchen speakers, everything around me slowed down in a strange, almost surreal way, as if the walls and windows were pulling themselves slightly farther away from me and leaving me exposed and alone in the center of something I didn't understand. I was holding my coffee mug in both hands as if it could ground me in the moment, but nothing could prepare me for the words that followed. My voice, unmistakable, intimate, painfully honest. I don't even remember who leaned in first. I only know that when our lips met, something in me woke up. Something that hadn't stirred in years. He didn't say a word as my voice faded and the recorder clicked itself off like punctuation at the end of a sentence that no one was ready to acknowledge. He turned and walked away before I could speak, and the door to his office clicked shut behind him with the same eerie restraint that seemed to coat everything he did these past few weeks. I stood still in the middle of the kitchen, the heat from the mug warming the inside of my hands but doing absolutely nothing to stop the cold spreading down the back of my spine. I had no idea how that file ended up on his device. No memory of sending it, no draft in my email that could explain what I had just heard play out loud between us. Or rather, only to me, since he left before the final sentence finished playing. All I knew was that I had recorded that entry late at night when I couldn't sleep, when the house was too quiet, and my thoughts refused to lie down with me. It wasn't supposed to be sent anywhere. It was just a way of breathing into the silence. A method of emptying out the questions I couldn't ask out loud, like, what exactly am I holding on to? This marriage, this routine, this woman I've become? Or is it just the fear of breaking something I spent my life protecting? But now it was out. Now he had heard it. Now everything I hadn't said stood between us like smoke. A few hours passed in a fog I couldn't shake off, and just as I finished folding the last of the towels in the laundry room, he appeared in the doorway with that same neutral expression that never gave anything away, but somehow managed to say more than words ever could. "We should get someone to help around the house," he said while looking past me toward the hallway closet, as if he had already rehearsed this line and decided this was the moment to deliver it. I didn't reply, partly because I wasn't sure if it was a suggestion or a decision already made, and partly because I was still holding that morning's audio like a shard of glass behind my ribs. "He's free this summer," he added without naming anyone, as if we both already knew who he meant. And in that moment, I felt my stomach tighten in a way that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with memory. By late afternoon, the doorbell rang, and when I opened it, there he stood with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder, a quiet ease in his posture, and that same open, watchful face that had somehow aged and stayed the same all at once. His eyes met mine with a flicker of recognition, and then he smiled the way people do when they're not entirely sure what the rules are anymore. "Hey," he said, lifting the bag slightly like a peace offering. "Welcome back," I said, hearing how stiff my voice sounded even as I tried to soften it with a smile that didn't fully reach my eyes. "He said I could crash here while I help out," he added after stepping inside and letting the door close behind him. I nodded without really looking at either of them, and my husband simply gestured toward the guest room and then disappeared again into his study, leaving the two of us standing there in the hallway as if we were figures in a paused movie scene no one had the courage to resume. The air felt thicker than it should have for such a mild day, and as I turned to take the laundry upstairs, I felt his eyes on my back like a pressure that wasn't forceful, but still unmistakably present. That evening passed in small, polite exchanges that felt carefully edited, like we were both afraid of saying too much or too little, and by the time I climbed into bed, my body was tired, but my mind refused to rest. At some point around midnight, I picked up my phone again and opened the voice note app, my finger hovering above the red circle as if waiting for permission from someone who would never give it. I finally pressed record and let the words come out in one long, uninterrupted stream of breath and thought, not knowing if I would delete it or keep it or send it or bury it like the others before. I don't know if he heard everything or if he only played that one file, but I can't pretend the silence between us means forgiveness or even understanding. I whispered into the phone while staring at the ceiling, barely able to feel the blanket wrapped around me. And now he's here, I added, my voice quieter. He's walking through the same rooms, touching the same doorknobs, moving in and out of my space like we're just family again. There was a long pause, the kind that doesn't feel empty, but rather full of all the things you can't name. And then I ended the recording with a breath that didn't come easy. The next morning, I found him in the hallway, lifting an old box of tools from the floor and turning just in time to see me watching him. Want help with that? He asked with a tone that was too casual, too practiced, as if he already knew the answer but needed to go through the motions anyway. I nodded, letting him take the box from me. And as he did, our hands touched briefly. A simple moment. But the skin of his palm against mine lit something I thought I'd buried too deep to feel again. He didn't pull away immediately. Neither did I. And then he carried the box into the garage without saying another word, leaving me standing in the hallway with a question inside me that refused to go away. Did he feel it too? The next morning begins with the sound of the hallway cabinet closing softly behind him as he moves through the house without pausing or asking if I slept well or whether I need anything from the store. He walks into the kitchen with quiet steps and pours himself a glass of water like it's just another day. And nothing has shifted between us since that strange moment yesterday with the recorder and the silence that followed. He looks over at me briefly while he drinks, but doesn't say much beyond a neutral comment about the weather and something vague about going into town to pick up paint for the fence outside. The fence doesn't need painting. He had it redone last year by contractors from the city. But I nod slowly and keep my eyes on the sink, just long enough to avoid the tension building in his stillness. He mentions casually that someone will be helping out around the house today, and that I might want to be around when he arrives, so I can show him where the tools are kept and what needs attention. He doesn't use a name or a title, just he, as if that word should be enough to prepare me for what's about to happen. My hands are damp from washing the cups, and I dry them on the towel too quickly, which causes it to fall to the floor, but I don't pick it up right away. A few hours later, he rings the doorbell, even though he never used to before, and I find myself walking toward the entryway with a strange knot forming in my chest that feels heavier with each step I take. When I open the door, I see him standing there with his duffel bag slung low on one shoulder and a slightly tentative look in his eyes like he's unsure how this moment is supposed to feel between us. His posture is more upright than I remember, and his face has hardened just slightly in the jaw. But there's still a trace of the boy he was when I first met him, standing awkwardly by the garden gate all those years ago. He gives me a soft smile and says something polite about the drive, but his eyes are moving across my face slowly, like he's noticing the changes even if he doesn't name them. I tell him where the guest room is and offer to make tea, but he says he's fine and moves toward the hallway with a quiet confidence that makes me stay standing in the doorway a few seconds too long. As he passes by the kitchen, he glances toward the table where the recorder had been placed yesterday, and for 1 second I wonder if he knows what happened, if he can feel the tension humming under the surface. Later that day, I carry a small box of old cleaning supplies from the back closet and try not to think too much about the way my fingers are shaking, even though the box isn't particularly heavy. He appears behind me suddenly with a steady voice and says he'll take it from here, and before I can object, he's already reaching for it, and our hands touch again just briefly, but with enough pressure to make something stir in me that I didn't expect. The moment stretches a second longer than it should, and I feel the warmth of his hand against mine as clearly as if it were still there, even after he's already walked away. As the day goes on, I hear my husband's voice from his office a few times, but he never asks how things are going and doesn't step out to join us or even check on the repairs. I keep myself busy with laundry and kitchen drawers and unopened mail, but I can't stop my eyes from drifting toward the guest room door or the back window where he's standing now, fixing the small crack in the step. At dinner, the three of us sit at the same table we've used for years, but the silence between each course feels like something new. Something thick and uncomfortable and full of invisible questions we're all too careful to avoid. My husband compliments the seasoning on the rice and asks him how the repairs went, but he never looks at me and doesn't reference the morning or the recorder or the sound of my voice admitting something I never meant to share. After dinner, he goes back to his office and closes the door behind him with the same quiet pressure as before, and I'm left standing near the kitchen window watching the light change across the edge of the trees. The room feels too big for one person, and I notice how the chair across from mine still holds the indentation of his shoulders, as if the warmth hadn't quite faded yet. I pick up my phone from the counter and open the voice memo app again, almost without thinking, like my body knows what to do before my mind catches up with it. The red record button blinks softly, and I hesitate before pressing it because I'm no longer sure these recordings are safe or whether any space truly belongs to me anymore. I press it anyway, and let the words slip out like they always do, even though I know he might hear them. Even though I know I've already made one mistake that can't be undone. I felt something in his hand when he touched mine this afternoon. I say quietly into the speaker while sitting at the edge of the bed, still wearing the same sweater I had on since morning. I don't know if he meant it or if I just imagined it because I wanted to. I add slowly, letting each word settle as if testing their weight before committing to them. My throat tightens slightly, and I pause because the air in the room feels thinner than usual, and I can't tell if it's from guilt or fear, or something more dangerous I don't want to name. What am I doing? This is the one thought I can't silence. I stop the recording before I can say more because I already feel like I've said too much, and yet still haven't gotten close to the truth of what's happening inside me. As I close the app, I see the last recording still saved and untouched, the one he heard. And I don't delete it even though every part of me tells me I should. It stays there like a quiet threat, or maybe a confession, waiting to be understood by someone who no longer asks, but listens anyway. Before going to bed, I step into the hallway and find the guest room door slightly ajar with light spilling out and the sound of soft music playing from his phone placed near the window. He's not speaking or moving much, just sitting by the edge of the bed with a book in his hand. And when he notices me, he doesn't look startled or surprised. He just nods once and asks if I need anything in a voice that's calm and low and carries no accusation, but something in it still makes my chest tighten slightly. I say no and wish him a good night. But I linger longer than necessary, and when I turn away, I feel his eyes follow me down the hallway without ever leaving the chair. Something is beginning, and I don't know how to stop it without unraveling everything I've tried so hard to hold together. The sound of his voice calling me from the other room reaches me just as I finish straightening the cushions on the living room sofa, and something in the evenness of his tone makes me hesitate before answering. He asks if I'm free this evening and mentions that he thought it would be nice for the three of us to sit down together over a meal like we used to before. Life became fragmented into separate routines and closed doors. There's a calmness in his eyes when I glance at him that doesn't match the sharp precision with which he wipes the counter or folds the cloth napkins into careful rectangles by the stove. He doesn't mention the recorder or the note I left on the fridge the day before that simply said, "Gone for a walk." Even though I didn't walk farther than the corner of the backyard fence where the trees block the view from the kitchen window. I say yes and try to smile in a way that doesn't feel forced, but my jaw feels heavier than usual, as if every small gesture now carries the weight of something unsaid between us. When the evening arrives, the table is set with an attention to detail that borders on ceremonial, and I notice the wine he placed near the forks is the one I once mentioned offhandedly during a vacation we barely spoke on. He tells me to take my time with getting ready, and that he's already spoken to him earlier about the evening plans, and I nod slowly before moving toward the bedroom with a kind of practiced grace that I know won't fool either of them. The moment I walk back into the dining room and see them both standing near the table, something inside me shifts again because the way they look at me is not the same. Look at me. He gives me a nod and gestures to the chair across from him while the younger one stands still for a moment too long, before pulling out my chair and saying, "I look very well tonight," with a voice that sounds different than usual. It's smoother and more deliberate, and for a brief second I catch myself wondering whether he had practiced that compliment or if it simply came out because he meant it, which somehow feels more dangerous. Dinner begins with harmless conversation about the roof and the tools and the rust on the garden gate, and I focus on the food in front of me because the space between their voices leaves too much room for the echo of mine. He asks me about the guest room and whether everything feels in order for a long stay, and I answer politely while pretending not to hear the subtext sewn between his words, like thread pulled too tight. At one point, he leans forward to refill my glass and brushes my hand slightly as he steadies the bottle, and I don't pull away, because doing so would make it seem important, which somehow makes it more so. The air thickens with each exchange, and every silence between bites stretches out longer than the last until finally my husband sets down his fork and looks at me directly across the table with that same unreadable calm from before. Do you still record voice notes sometimes? He asks with a tone that could belong to a friend or a stranger depending on the moment, and I nod once with a small smile that doesn't hide my confusion. Sometimes, I say softly while feeling the younger man glance toward me without lifting his head completely. You always had things to say that no one else knew how to hear. He replies gently before reaching for his water and taking a slow sip like he hasn't just opened a door I wasn't ready to walk through. After dinner, I offer to clean up, but he says no, and that I should sit outside for a while since the weather is warm and the night quiet, and I know that means he wants time alone with the younger one inside the house. I step out onto the patio and take a seat in the corner chair beneath the overhanging branches where the breeze moves through the leaves just enough to make them murmur softly like they're trying to warn me. The evening air feels gentle on my skin, but my heart is unsettled, and I watch the lights through the kitchen window until I see him step outside to join me with 2 mugs of herbal tea and a soft glance that doesn't ask for anything. He sits beside me in the second chair and stretches his legs forward with a slow breath before turning toward me and saying that the night feels lighter than usual, like something has shifted. I nod slowly without answering and sip the tea he hands me while trying not to notice the warmth of his knee only inches from mine, or the fact that I remember how his hands felt the last time they brushed against mine. We sit there without speaking for several long minutes that feel stretched out across the space like threads of thought neither of us wants to pull too hard, and the silence becomes almost comfortable until it isn't. He turns slightly toward me and says my name so quietly, I almost pretend I didn't hear it just to delay whatever is coming next. When I look at him, I see a kind of hesitation in his eyes that doesn't match the steadiness of his posture, and then he leans closer, just enough that I can feel the shift in air between us. I think about what you said sometimes, he says without blinking, and I realize in that moment that he has heard more than I wanted him to, and less than I feared. I ask softly what he means, but the words barely leave my mouth before he reaches up and tucks a loose strand of hair behind my ear with a tenderness that catches me off guard. The touch is brief but undeniable, and for a heartbeat I freeze because something in me responds in a way that makes me feel exposed and unsure all at once. He looks at me for a moment too long and then says, he's sorry if that was inappropriate, but I don't reply, because the space between us has changed and we both know it. Before I can stop myself, I lean forward just slightly and our foreheads almost touch, and then without thinking, or maybe finally without resisting, our lips meet in a kiss that lasts only a second, but says too much. We pull away at the same time, and he turns his face slightly toward the trees, like he's afraid of what he might see reflected in mine. My hands rest on my lap, unmoving, while my pulse hammers in my chest so loudly I wonder if he can hear it through the quiet. Nothing about the moment feels planned or rehearsed, but everything about it feels irreversible. He wakes up earlier than usual and moves around the kitchen without making much sound, as though his presence could remain unnoticed if he steps lightly enough and avoids eye contact with anyone who might ask questions. I hear him placing 2 coffee mugs on the counter before he calls my name and asks if I want to walk with him to the nursery to pick up something for the garden beds, which he says look like they've gone a bit wild this season. I nod slowly and agree before I even think about it, because part of me wants to spend time outside the house today, and the other part doesn't want to be alone inside with thoughts that feel louder every morning. He drives with one hand on the wheel and the other resting calmly in his lap, and for most of the short drive, neither of us says much, although the silence doesn't feel empty exactly, but it isn't comfortable either. When we get to the nursery, he walks ahead through the narrow aisles between rows of plants and shrubs, and I follow with my hands in my pockets, feeling a breeze move through the greenhouse roof vents and shift my hair gently against my neck. At one point, he turns around and points to a cluster of hanging lavender baskets and says they would look good near the back window where the light is softer, and I realize he remembers the spot I told him I like most in the afternoons. We pick 3 baskets and carry them to the car, and when I reach to open the trunk, he moves behind me to lift the hatch, and his hand brushes the small of my back in a way that feels like a mistake, but lingers too long to be dismissed. Neither of us comments on it, but I feel his breath just behind my shoulder, and I step forward to create space without looking at him because I know the shape of the tension between us, even when no one speaks it aloud. When we return home, the house feels cooler than before, as if something inside it noticed we'd both been away and wants to remind us we belong to routines we haven't yet broken fully. I spend the early afternoon arranging the new plants near the back window and trying to ignore the sound of his footsteps crossing the upstairs landing, or the way I keep glancing out of habit every time I hear a drawer open or close. The scent of lavender fills the kitchen slowly as sunlight moves across the floor and touches the edge of the rug beneath the table where he once sat with that same unreadable calm that now feels impossible to forget. At some point, I realize he's behind me again, holding a small watering can and asking if I need help adjusting the hooks, which are still slightly crooked from when we first installed them together last spring. He reaches up to fix the angle, and his fingers slide along the metal bracket with quiet focus. And when the hook slips slightly, he catches it with his other hand just above mine and steadies it without flinching. Our hands rest on the same wooden frame for a moment, and his fingers are warm and steady and so close to mine that the only thing keeping us from touching again is the fragile intention not to. I turn away before the pause becomes a decision and excuse myself to fold laundry that doesn't need folding, just to give my body something to do, besides remembering the way his eyes lingered on mine without blinking. Later that evening, he disappears into the guest room with the door closed, and I notice how the house falls into a slower rhythm after that, as if it too is waiting for something to shift or end or begin again. My husband walks into the living room at sunset with a softness in his face that doesn't quite match the firmness in his voice when he asks if I'll come upstairs early tonight, because he hasn't slept well the last few nights and misses the quiet comfort of falling asleep beside me. I hesitate for only a second, but he notices, and I know this because his hand brushes mine briefly when I pass him the glass of water he asked for, and his eyes study my expression like he's memorizing the small ways I betray myself. We climb the stairs together, and the floorboards creak the same way they always have. But tonight the sound feels louder than usual, as if every step is amplified by the silence we keep choosing instead of words. In the bedroom, he changes quietly and slides under the covers before reaching for the lamp and dimming it to a warm, low glow that softens the lines of his face but does nothing to erase the space between us. I lie down beside him and feel the warmth of his shoulder beneath the sheet and the steady rhythm of his breathing and the way his hand rests close to mine but never moves to close the gap. He turns toward me and kisses me on the temple with the kind of familiarity that should comfort me, but instead leaves a hollow ache in my chest that I try not to breathe too deeply into. His touch is gentle and practiced and means to reassure me, but something about it makes me feel smaller instead of held, and I wonder if he notices that my body doesn't lean in the way it used to. I press my cheek to the pillow and close my eyes and listen to the quiet hum of the ceiling fan while my mind tries to settle into something that feels normal, even though I know it isn't. How long can a person pretend to feel something they don't without it eventually showing through? The bed is soft and the room is still, but inside me the noise grows louder and more restless until I'm no longer sure if I'm awake or simply trapped in the space between sleeping and waiting. He whispers goodnight and reaches for my hand under the covers, and I let him hold it because it's easier than pulling away and saying the things I know he doesn't want to hear out loud. His fingers close gently around mine, and I close my eyes again and let my breath slow down while my other hand stays clenched beneath the sheet against the mattress, as if anchoring me to something real. The darkness settles across the room, and I hear him begin to drift off into sleep, and I stay still beside him for a long time with my eyes wide open, staring into the ceiling as if it might offer answers I haven't dared ask yet. The house sleeps, but I do not. The morning air carries a heaviness that I feel before I even open the blinds, and the house smells like lavender, and something faintly metallic that I can't place but decide not to question. He isn't in the kitchen when I come downstairs, and I assume he's in the garage again, checking the lock on the tool cabinet that never seems to stay shut no matter how many times it's adjusted. I move through the day slowly and deliberately, completing small tasks that don't require decisions or opinions or reflection. And when I open the hall closet, I find the laundry basket already full, even though I did a load only 2 days ago. He appears in the doorway as I gather towels and says he was about to do it himself, and I tell him there's no need because I've already started, and he just nods while watching me a second too long. In the laundry room, the scent of detergent hits me harder than usual, and I try not to focus on the fact that the room feels too warm, or that the hum of the dryer seems louder than it should be. He steps in behind me, carrying a handful of white t-shirts and places them on top of the machine without speaking, and the closeness between us makes my shoulders tense without my permission. There's not much space to move, and when I turn to adjust the dial, our arms brush together, and I feel the contact like a pulse moving from skin to skin without delay. He doesn't speak, but I hear his breath shift slightly, and his eyes meet mine with a steadiness that makes it impossible to pretend that we're not both standing here fully aware of what we're doing. His hand moves before his voice, and he touches my arm with a quiet firmness that holds no hesitation, and I don't step away because my body doesn't want to. And maybe that's the first real betrayal. His other hand moves slowly to my waist, with a pressure that feels more like a question than an answer. And when I don't move, he leans in and kisses me with a hunger that startles me with its gentleness. The kiss is slow and deep, and fills the small space with something electric that makes my heart feel too big for my chest, and I respond without thinking, because thinking has become too dangerous. My fingers find the back of his neck, and I press against him harder than I mean to, because something inside me is pushing forward with a force I don't recognize. His breath is fast against my cheek, and his hands slide under the edge of my shirt just slightly, and I let them, because I want this with a certainty that should terrify me more than it does. He lifts me gently onto the edge of the machine, and I feel the vibration beneath me mixing with the heat of his body, and I close my eyes to block out the last flicker of doubt. But just as he moves closer, the sound of a door unlocking from the front hallway slams into us like a sudden wave of cold air through the heat. We freeze. The moment breaks apart without a word, and I slide quickly from the washer with my feet unsteady and my heart pounding too loudly for the silence that follows. He steps back without speaking and runs a hand through his hair as I fix my shirt and listen for the footsteps I already know are coming down the hallway. My husband enters the kitchen a minute later, carrying a bag from the store, and says he forgot his phone, but his voice is lighter than it should be, and that tells me everything. I look at the counter and notice a single envelope placed neatly near the fruit bowl, and when I reach for it, I see my name written in his handwriting with a steadiness that sends a chill through my hands. He says nothing as he watches me open it, and inside, I find a printed sheet of paper with the title Journal Notes 04-09 at the top, and the first line is mine, word for word, from a recording I never sent. My breath catches, and he turns away toward the fridge as if this interaction is just another part of the day and not the moment everything begins to unravel from the inside out. I take the paper and walk quickly upstairs to my bedroom and close the door with care before sitting on the edge of the bed and opening my laptop with shaking fingers that don't want to know what's waiting. The screen lights up and there's a folder on the desktop titled Voice Transcripts, and inside it are dozens of files labeled with dates and times and phrases I vaguely recognize as pieces of myself. I click on one and read the first paragraph, and it is me, and it is not me, because seeing my thoughts on a screen makes them feel like evidence instead of feelings. The words I never meant to say aloud are now arranged in neat columns with time codes and formatting, and the part of me that used to feel private feels distant and dissected. I try to breathe slowly and force myself to keep reading because I need to understand just how much he has heard and how far this has already gone without me realizing it. There is no anger in the notes, no commentary or corrections, just a quiet archiving of every word I whispered into my phone thinking I was alone when I never really was. I scroll further and find one entry that stops me cold. A line about the kiss, the one I never spoke of, and yet it's there in full like someone has taken it from inside my memory and typed it without asking. I close the laptop with a weight that sinks into my chest, and I stare at the closed screen like it might blink or speak or offer an answer that doesn't end in silence. Why didn't I notice this sooner? I should have known. I sit still for a long time with the envelope in my lap and the sound of footsteps downstairs moving in and out of rooms that once felt safe now just echoing with too much space. The house feels different now, like it belongs to someone else, and I am only visiting the version of my life that used to be intact before I gave it away one recording at a time. The light outside begins to fade slowly, and I don't turn on the lamp because shadows feel more honest than brightness right now. I lie back on the bed with the paper resting on my chest and listen to the hum of the ceiling fan and the soft creak of the floor, as someone walks past the door without stopping. He knows. They both know. And I no longer know what happens next. The morning light moves slowly across the floor as I sit at the edge of the bed and try to gather my thoughts into something that resembles clarity. But the more I try, the heavier they become. The laptop remains closed on the desk where I left it the night before, and the paper from the envelope still lies on the dresser like a quiet reminder of everything I no longer know how to control. I get dressed with steady movements and avoid the mirror because my reflection feels unfamiliar now, and I'm not ready to face the version of myself that let things get this far. Downstairs, the kitchen smells like toast and coffee, and the sounds are ordinary enough to almost believe that everything could still be normal if I just leaned into it hard enough and pretended for long enough. He is already seated at the table when I walk in, and he looks up with that same unreadable expression he's worn for days and gestures toward the empty chair across from him without saying anything. I sit down without speaking, and my hands fold on my lap because I know anything I do too quickly might break the moment or move it in a direction I can't undo. He lifts his coffee mug and takes a slow sip, and I notice the way his eyes don't leave mine this time, as if he's waiting for me to speak first, but also ready to interrupt the silence if I wait too long. I want to talk. I say finally with a voice that feels thinner than usual and less certain than I want it to sound. But I let the sentence sit between us anyway. He nods once and places the mug back on the coaster, and I can tell he has already decided what this conversation will be, even if I don't know the shape of it yet. I never meant to. I begin again, but stop because the words sound weak even to me, and I see the flicker of recognition in his eyes that confirms he agrees. He doesn't interrupt or rush me, but something in the way he watches me makes the silence feel like a mirror turned inward, and I start again with more weight behind the words this time. I tried to keep distance. I tried to stop it before it became real. But I didn't succeed. And now I don't know what to do with the consequences that have already arrived. He tilts his head slightly and asks a question that lands like a stone dropped in still water. How many times? The question is calm and his voice steady, but something beneath it makes my hands close tighter together and my heart stutter against my ribs as if it expected another question entirely. I don't answer right away because the truth feels like it doesn't belong to language anymore, and putting it into words would give it a permanence I'm not sure I can live with. His eyes stay on mine, and I know he isn't asking for an exact number or even for the truth as much as he's asking whether I'm still capable of saying anything that isn't wrapped in silence. I manage a quiet response. Enough for you to stop trusting me completely. And that feels more honest than trying to give it a count or timeline that wouldn't matter anyway. He nods again and looks down at the folder beside his plate as if remembering something he meant to do, and then pushes it gently across the table until it rests in front of me. It's thicker than I expect, and the paper inside is clean and neatly bound together with black clips holding everything in place like an archive built with care. I printed them all, he says without emotion but not without intention, and I don't move to open the folder right away because I already know what's inside. Every voice note, every half sentence, every whispered recording made into text and ordered by date and time like a documentary of everything I thought I was hiding. You wanted to be heard, he adds slowly while rising from his chair and taking his mug with him toward the sink where he pours the remaining coffee out with steady movements. I heard you. Those are the last words he says before leaving the room, and I remain seated with my fingers resting lightly on the top of the folder, as if touching it too hard might trigger something I can't control. He doesn't leave the house completely, but I don't see him for the rest of the day, and I don't ask where he's gone because part of me thinks I no longer have the right to ask. The guest room door stays closed, and I walk past it 3 times without knocking because I no longer trust myself to say anything that wouldn't make it worse. Outside, the garden looks still, and the lavender baskets shift slightly in the breeze, but even the plants feel quieter than before, as if the weight of this house has pressed down into the soil itself. I bring the folder upstairs and place it on the bed beside me, and then sit cross-legged facing it with the blinds half closed and the fan spinning slowly overhead. I open the cover and begin reading the first few lines, and the words are mine, but they no longer feel like me. And I wonder if this is how it begins. The slow separation of self from story. Each entry is dated precisely and laid out with line breaks and timestamps, and I find myself mouthing the sentences as if hearing them again might bring some different meaning to the surface. Some of them are tender and clumsy and painfully human, and others feel like echoes from a woman I don't remember becoming but recognize too well to ignore. Near the end of the folder, I find a final page that isn't typed like the others, but written by hand in his usual neat block letters, and the paper is heavier than the rest. There are only a few words, but they land harder than anything I've read in weeks. You wanted to be heard. I listened. You were never alone. That's the part you never believed. I don't need an answer. I just needed to know you still had one. I fold the page carefully and slide it back between the others before closing the folder with quiet hands and placing it back on the nightstand beside the lamp that hasn't been turned on since yesterday. I lie back on the bed and stare at the ceiling and listen to the faint hum of the world moving around the edges of this room where everything I used to be now sits too close and too far all at once. The house feels heavier now than it did yesterday. Maybe it always will.